Our last chapter, Public Policy in Texas. And this is my favorite chapter because public policy is what I research and what I do. So, just to kind of give you a quick rundown of how policy works. This graph kind of establishes the policy process. And so, to start the process, we start at problem identification. So, policy is just, how does government address a problem? What is their plan? What are they going to do about it? So, to know why we would need to create a policy, we would have to identify the problem. So, what is the problem we're dealing with? Who does it affect? What is it costing? All that kind of stuff. The second step, agenda setting. What are the viewpoints on this issue? What are the citizens' concerns? Is there a solution that already exists to this problem? Has someone tried something previously that worked? Then step 3, policy formulation. So once we decide what the problem is and how we want to approach the problem, we then come up with ideas about how we could address that. So if we think about something like air quality, we want to come up with a policy to improve air quality. Well, what are some of the things we could do? We could require that cars have better emissions. We could require that people pay higher registration fees for their vehicle, have better public transportation. These are all ideas for that particular policy issue. So we just throw all these ideas out there when we're trying to formulate something, and hopefully we come together with a cohesive plan to address the problem. Policy adoption. This is once we have our plan put together, we put it into a legislative format like a bill, and then we take it to the state legislature or the federal legislature and get them to vote and adopt that policy. Now, once they pass the bill, implementation is usually left up to the bureaucracy, like we talked about. They'll find the appropriate government agencies that deal with this particular issue. So if we're talking about air quality, this would be the Texas Agency on Environmental Quality, or at the federal level, the EPA, things like that, and instruct them on how to carry out this policy. And then once the policy's been in place for X amount of time, we're going to evaluate it. Is this policy working? Is it actually helping to solve the problem? If it's not, what can we do? And so that's why this makes a circle, because this cycle never really stops. It's constantly going on in government. And then, of course, we have other people who can get involved, like political parties, interest groups, and things like that. And so, there's a lot of people that play a role in this whole process. Sometimes after a policy is evaluated, if it's working, we don't touch it. We don't mess with it. If it's not working, do we need to come up with a whole new policy, or do we just need to kind of tweak it a bit? And so we don't always start from scratch. Sometimes we'll take an existing policy and make some changes to it, rework it, and make it more effective. And then, of course, we're constantly checking in with citizens to see how the citizens are responding to it. Do they approve? Are they unhappy? And then a lot of times citizens are going to let government know that they're unhappy with things like protest or letter writing campaigns or emailing their elected officials. But policy is one of the more difficult parts of government, because it requires a lot of time, a lot of expertise and research to come up with policy. And then you have to constantly be checking in with the stakeholders in a policy, like the citizens or the government itself, to make sure that they are happy with what's being done. So public policy it's kind of, I would say political science is very much kind of like a lot of theories about government, and public policy is like how you put that stuff into actual application to do the work of government. So that's kind of the difference there. So if we look at where the federal government and where the states handle policy, the federal government has control when we're dealing with foreign policy, like how we interact with other countries, military and defense policy, and interstate commerce, the interstate economy, the business that's taking place all over the country. States are given most of the power in how they deal with local issues. A lot of times, this will be things like business, labor. Texas, again, like we said, it's a very business friendly state, not as friendly to labor, which is the people doing the work rather than the businesses creating the jobs. And this is why, you know, labor unions exist and things like that, which we've talked about in other chapters. Here in Texas, sometimes our business policy can have negative effects on workers. We have things like right to work laws, collective bargaining laws that kind of make it tough for people in Texas to, workers to come together and demand change. In the last chapter, when we were talking about taxes, a lot of businesses are given tax cuts, which take money out of the community in favor of getting the businesses to come to the state in the first place or come to a certain city. And we even established what's called the Texas Enterprise Fund, which is government money that can be given to corporations and grants to try and get them to bring their business to Texas. And we've spent about $580 million since 2003. But these policies have been criticized. It's essentially, some people call it corporate welfare, that, Texas is giving out these just essentially just free money to corporations to come to the state while not giving relief in other areas like low-income families or funding education and things like that. And it kind of falls in that kind of crony capitalism where a lot of people are giving favors to people they know. And, like if we're talking about like a corporation like Amazon, do they really need to be given more money? They're, the most successful corporation in the world. So there are some problems when it comes to business policy here in the state. We also have really low regulation on land allocation and use, and so this leads to more construction in our state. But sometimes where the market can be oversaturated with new homes or new businesses, like one of the examples I like to use, if you've ever been to, some of you know Fort Worth really well, some of you may not. If you look at West 7th Street, if you go over there to that Crockett Row or whatever they're calling it now, you can see that, this is a big investment for the city of Fort Worth. They built all this mixed use buildings where you have businesses at the bottom, you have apartments at the top. And if you happen to notice, those businesses change really often. UTA did a similar thing with the new development on campus over there, where those restaurants are and things like that on campus. Those businesses are constantly changing, and one of the reasons why is because all of this new investment in building costs money, so the rents in those areas are very high, and sometimes businesses can't thrive because their rent is so high. Or those apartments, the rent, it's like, $2,000 for a studio apartment. So sometimes, it makes you question, who is this being built for? And if we can't keep those businesses full, if we can't keep tenants in there, is it really benefiting the city at all? And then, of course, another downside is the destruction of green space and nature. And Fort Worth and Dallas both have done a really good job of preserving green area. Here in Fort Worth, where I live, we've got the Trinity Park and the trails that go all over the city. Dallas has a lot like Katy Trail and a bunch of parks all around. But not all cities do that. Not all cities invest in trying to preserve green space like that. And so this massive expansion of business and stuff in the cities can take away that the natural environment. Texas also has really strict regulation on eminent domain, meaning that if the state is going to try and seize your land, they have to have a really good reason to do so and give you fair market compensation for that. All right. Now, one area of policy that's always very controversial is welfare policy. Welfare and healthcare. So this is a responsibility that is shared by the federal government and the state government. The welfare programs are mandated by the federal government and administered by the state, and they share responsibility in funding them. The federal government provides most of the funding. I think it's about a 60-40 split. But the federal government also sets the standards for how to qualify, but states have a little leeway in determining those as well. But when we talk about government welfare programs, we're talking about Medicaid, which is just bare minimum health insurance for people living in poverty, extreme poverty, or people with like disabilities and things like that. CHIP is the same thing, but for children. It stands for Children's Health Insurance Program, and it's for children whose parents, don't make a whole lot of money. It's a low-cost insurance program, so that at least, if the parents may not have health insurance, but at least they can get health insurance for their kid. TANF, Temporary Aid to Needy Families. This is for the most vulnerable, the most, someone who is just like, they've hit rock bottom. The government will give them kind of a one-time cash payment, but it can only be used once in a lifetime. And it's for people who are at this is like less than $5,000 a year. This is extreme poverty. SNAP is what we commonly refer to as food stamps. WIC stands for Women and Children. Usually low-income pregnant women qualify for this. They get low-cost food and supplements and vitamins that they need while they're pregnant. And then we have housing programs like Section 8 and vouchers and things like that. The program, as you can imagine, that takes up most of the money is Medicaid. Healthcare costs are pretty insane in our country. And so a big chunk of the state's welfare budget goes to matching that federal money to help pay for this program. In Texas, about 15.7% of the population is on Medicaid, and we have still the highest rate of uninsured citizens in the country at 19%. I'm curious, I want to see how Corona affects that, because people are losing their jobs, which means that they're losing their health insurance as well, and so that could go up pretty drastically. When the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, was passed, it was up to the states to opt in to the Affordable Care Act, and Texas chose not to do so. What they would have had to do was lower their qualification standards for Medicaid, so more people would qualify, but the federal government would have given them the money to make up for that cost, and then all the rest of us would have benefited by getting low-cost insurance through the marketplace. Texas chose not to do this. Our state was pretty opposed to the Affordable Care Act from day one. We're still fighting it in the court system. So we didn't get the benefits that went with the Affordable Care Act because our state did not opt into it. We have one of the highest poverty rates in the country. As of 2014, we had about 16.4% of our total population living at or below the poverty level. Poverty level in the United States it's around $22,000 to $23,000 a year for a family of four. So that's very tough for a family of four in our country. Texas has about 15% of the population on SNAP or food stamp benefits. The average award is somewhere around $115 a month, which isn't a lot if you think about how much groceries cost. And welfare in our state accounts for 31.1% of all state expenditures. One of the criticisms, and that's kind of what this cartoon here is about, is that money that we're giving out to businesses and tax breaks that we give to the wealthy, we call that enterprise, or we call that, investment in business. But when we talk about giving aid to the poor and needy, people oppose that, call it socialism, call it a handout. But even though Texas has one of the biggest economies in the world, we still have one of the highest poverty rates in the country. So what that tells us is just because your state economy is doing well from a business standpoint, it doesn't always mean that your citizens and your workers are doing well. Primary and secondary education. So, like we said, education takes up the biggest chunk of our budget. Texas pays for public education, but the amount that the state pays has declined steadily over the past 20 years. If we look at 2014, 2015, Texas paid 41% of the cost of public education. The federal government made up another 10%, and the rest is made up at the local level. So those property taxes and those sales taxes that the local governments collect, they're having to make up a bigger and bigger portion of the cost of public education. And that's why the local governments tend to oppose putting a property tax cap, because they don't know how much more they're going to be required to pay, and that's really the only way they can make up the difference. So the other effect of this is we get better schools in wealthy neighborhoods. So if local taxes are funding the local school district, well, if you live somewhere like Southlake or Allen or McKinney, you're going to have an amazing school district. I think it was Allen and McKinney that spent like $60 million on a football stadium for their high school football team. Whereas if you live somewhere with a high concentration of poverty, like South Dallas or Stop Six in Fort Worth and places like that, the houses in those areas just aren't worth as much. And so they do not have the ability to raise as much tax revenue for their school districts. Back in 1991, the state of Texas proposed a plan to help with this called the Robin Hood Plan. And so the idea was they would take some money from wealthy districts and give it to poor districts in an attempt to kind of equalize the schools. But of course, wealthy people opposed this, challenged it in the court, and it was ruled unconstitutional in state court. And then they tried to do it again through a constitutional amendment, and voters rejected that amendment. So they went another direction. They put a new law in place where the state caps the amount of money spent per pupil at $319,500. That is an insane amount of money. Most school districts spend somewhere around $9,000 to $10,000 per student. So in your super wealthy districts that are exceeding this amount, they now have four options. They can take excess money and send it to the state and let the state reallocate that money. They can consolidate their district with a poorer district and share that money with them directly. They can send the money directly to a district that does not have as high a tax base, or they can split their school district into smaller districts so that they have less income per district. Of the 1,000, slightly higher than 1,000 school districts we have in Texas, 226 exceed that cap every year. So we should not be having the problem we have in public school with funding because of this, but we still see challenges pop up all the time. This system has been challenged in the court as well, but the Texas Supreme Court, upheld this program in 2016. Of course, one of the more controversial parts of schooling here in Texas is testing. Teachers don't like it, parents don't like it, students don't like it, but the State Board of Education and the Education Authority have set these guidelines for graduation, and standardized testing is part of those requirements. So we essentially are doing these standardized testing to make sure students are comprehending education at an appropriate level. But of course, the biggest areas of controversy are teachers feeling like they have no freedom in their classroom, that they have to teach to this test rather than focus on educational methods that may work better, because they have to worry about them passing this test. Not only so the kids will graduate, but a lot of times they're evaluated on how students do on these tests. Their pay is determined by it. And so there's been this talk for a very long time about, is there a better way to do this? And so far, Texas sticks with the standardized testing. We haven't moved away from it. Hopefully, that will change in the future. I personally don't like it and don't think it's the best way to evaluate, learning. Curriculum controversy. We talked a little bit about this in another chapter, but Texas is conservative, and so we have these issues that pop up about what is being taught in public education. Sex education. There are many, many, many districts in this state who still do not give comprehensive sex education classes. There's this push in Texas by a lot of religious people that sex education should be abstinence only, which means that children don't get education on things like safe sex and birth control and things like that. So that's a problem that we still have here in our state. And we used to have one of the highest teen pregnancy rates in the country. That has decreased a bit recently. Evolution versus creationism, again, another issue stemming from religion that you'll see this pop up from time to time, where there's a school district where parents are, opposing evolution and demanding that creationism be taught in the classroom alongside or instead of evolution. But that has been rejected by the Supreme Court, and they've set the rule on this a long time ago, probably about 50 or 60 years ago. Bilingual education. So bilingual education has actually been around in Texas for a very long time, and it's actually because there were a lot of German and Czech immigrants coming to Texas and they had a want to teach their children both their native language and English as well. So in the 1920s, the state legislature came in and prohibited education in any language other than English. Today we have ESL programs for English as a second language. The problem is that there's more and more of a growing need for these programs, but the funding doesn't keep up with it. So, and it's not just Spanish. It's also we have a very quickly growing population of Asian Americans in our country, people coming from Vietnam and the Philippines and places like that. Southeast Asians, India, people who are coming from a lot of different places and may not know English when they get here and need that ESL education to learn English, but we're not allocating enough funding to it currently. And then we talked about some race and culture issues in a previous chapter, so I won't go back into that. Now, higher education is an interesting one as well. Texas has, around the early 2000s, they deregulated tuition. If you go back to the 1970s, college education cost about $12 per class per semester and was controlled by the state government. But in the 1990s, our two biggest universities, A&M and UT, requested to increase tuition because of the demands of a growing student population and facility needs and all that kind of stuff. So a few years later, in 2003, the state deregulates tuition, which gives the schools the right to set their tuition. So in the fall of 2003, you could take 15 hours for 1900, and by the next year, that had increased to 2032, and now today the average is somewhere around 3,600 to 4,000 a semester. That is a 90% increase since tuition was deregulated. Now, why does tuition keep going up? Well, a lot of people demand a lot of things of the colleges they want their kids to go to. So now colleges have to compete not just on the quality of their education, but the how high tech the facilities are. Are there good sports programs? Do you have a fun gym to go work out in? And all of that takes money. And so that cost gets passed along to the students in the form of tuition. So there's been a lot of talk of tuition reform, that tuition has just gotten out of hand. Us being public school, that's not as big of a problem here, but there are some schools where it has gotten really out of hand. So the state sets aside money for education. Unfortunately, this doesn't go as much to higher education as it does to public education. So, Texas actually cut the amount of money it allocates to higher education by almost 20% between 2002 and 2007. So, more and more of the cost of higher education, even for public universities, is being made up through tuition increases. And then along with that has come curriculum changes, requirements for you to get your degree and graduate. And so now that has been capped at 120 hours in most fields. Some fields require more hours. It just depends. But one of the things that was happening before is schools wouldn't accept transfers from other schools, but Texas has kind of evened that playing field where universities have to accept credit hours from other schools, but they can reject any grades that are lower than a D. But they do have to, and there is an agreement among most Texas colleges and universities to accept transfer hours from each other. Um, and then higher education funding, most of it in the state of Texas comes from what we call the Permanent University Fund. So way back in the 1800s, in 1839, money was set aside for Texas A&M and the University of Texas. And what the state did was they bought this land out in East Texas and West Texas that was producing oil. Well, when they bought the land, it wasn't producing anything, but it became oil land closer to the 1900s. And so the money, the revenue that's generated from that land gets injected into those two universities. As of about 2015, the land has a market value of 17.4 billion. So that's kind of the collateral that kind of backs up our two biggest schools. Access to higher education. So, from the 1950s to the 70s, Texas universities all had what was called open enrollment, which, if you graduated from a Texas high school, you were automatically admitted to any of our public universities. Well, by the 1980s, the demand for a college education started to increase. And so the universities had to start limiting this open enrollment because they just had too many students. So in the 80s, UT and A&M started to impose, SAT requirements. And one of the arguments was that it made it harder for minority students to get into the schools because they were coming from underfunded public school districts. And so, we had affirmative action, for college for a while. But essentially, affirmative action doesn't work today the way it is assumed it does, especially not in Texas colleges. So there was a lawsuit. It's referred to as the Hopwood decision, which the federal courts ended affirmative action in Texas, the affirmative action that allowed race to be a determining factor for admission and financial aid. But that decision would be overturned in 2003. So it is up to the schools to determine how they use affirmative action. If you look around our school and you look around many large universities in our state, diversity and minority enrollment is not an issue the way it used to be. And so many schools do not have to use affirmative action anymore, but it is their right to. And another thing that they implemented was the top 10 rule, where instead of the open enrollment that schools used to have, now if you graduate in the top 10% of your class, you get admission to any of our public universities. The University of Texas has been sued a few times over the issue of affirmative action. The most recently, in 2013, there was a case called Fisher versus the University of Texas. This girl, incoming freshman, was applying to the University of Texas and was rejected. And she actually sued UT saying that Because of affirmative action, her spot was given to a minority student instead, et cetera, et cetera. It turns out she wasn't really qualified to go to the University of Texas based on scores and all the other things they use to evaluate grades, SAT scores, all that. So her case was, her case was thrown out, and the court upheld the use of affirmative action if the school chooses to. The issue, though, is most schools do not use it anymore because it's just not as necessary. Gun policy. Here in Texas, we have more guns than people. So when it comes to public policy about guns, Texas has actually taken a lot of interesting steps in the past decade. So over the past 10 years, Texas has loosened the requirements to own and carry a gun. As of 2016, and sometimes when we talk about public policy, policy is created where there was not a problem. And so gun policy kind of falls in this category. As of 2016, open carry allows licensed gun owners to carry holstered firearms in plain view, or if they have like an like an AR or something, they can carry it openly. You see this in a lot of the protests on TV and stuff like that. And that businesses can restrict it on their property, but if you're out in public on public property like a sidewalk or on say the Capitol steps in Austin, this is not supposed to be limited. The same year, Texas legislature passed campus carry, where you can carry concealed firearms on college campuses as long as you have a concealed handgun license. So any public university and public college has to comply. They cannot completely restrict the carrying of firearms, but they can institute some reasonable restrictions. Like on campus, you'll see signs that say you can't carry a firearm in here or here. Certain places it can be restricted. Now, one of the things that our legislature has been tossing around since these were instituted is the idea that you shouldn't have to have a concealed carry license at all. There are some states, Texas being one of them, that is debating this policy. The argument being is that the Second Amendment doesn't require licensing. Again, that argument over what well-regulated means. Will we get there? I don't know about that one. That one kind of makes me a little nervous, but at least if you have to get a license, you have to go through some kind of training and education about firearms and things like that. If we just allow anybody to carry a gun just because they don't have to, the training is very minimal as it is, but at least it's something. If anything, I foresee our gun laws getting looser in Texas, our gun policy, than getting stricter anytime soon. Another one, Texas has generated a lot of controversy over LGBT rights. So long before the decision in 2015 to legalize gay marriage, Texas was one of the states that had taken a strong stance against gay rights. And so there was talk at one point of a constitutional amendment to declare marriage between one man and one woman. In the state of Texas, we still have problems when it comes to gay marriage. Like, as you know, in 2015, it's legalized, and immediately after, we see Texas trying to deny insurance benefits to state employees who are married to a same-sex partner. We still see Texas, pushing issues that they would like to overturn this ruling. In Texas right now, some workers are not protected from being fired from their jobs for being LGBT. So there's still some ways to go on this particular issue. Here in Texas, state agencies are not allowed to discriminate when it comes to adoption. So if it's a state adoption agency, they cannot discriminate against a gay couple. The problem is that most of Texas adoptions are handled by private organizations, most who are religiously affiliated. Catholic Charities is one of them in North Texas that facilitates adoptions. And those groups will not adopt to gay couples. And because the adoptions are handled through them, it's kind of a loophole that allows for that discrimination to continue. Like we said, there are still no anti discrimination laws prohibiting LGBT individuals from being fired, evicted from their home, or refused service at a business. So that is something that it's being discussed at the federal level, but we're still waiting on any kind of legislation for that. Um, at the municipal level, some cities have done this at the local government level. Dallas, Fort Worth, and San Antonio have laws protecting LGBT individuals within the city limits. Houston put this issue to the voters and it was rejected. But the state again says that they don't have to recognize these laws because the cities do not have the authority to do this. So again, we have that clash between the more liberal cities versus the more conservative state government. And then I won't go into it too much, but you remember a few years ago the whole transgender bathroom issue, and our lieutenant governor wants laws saying that you have to use the bathroom that's on your birth certificate, all that kind of stuff. So that was a really big, it like blew up for like a year and then it kind of went away. The problem is that those issues don't ever really go away. They're just not getting as much attention. So sometimes you'll see someone propose a bill for something like that and it doesn't get media coverage, so we don't really know what's going on. But all of these are issues that are still being debated by our state legislature. Abortion. Abortion is probably one of the issues that Texas pushes back the most on. Of course, 1973, Roe versus Wade, it overturned a Texas law that declared abortion, basically that made abortion illegal. Roe versus Wade declared that unconstitutional. But Texas, more than any other state, has pushed as hard as they can against Roe versus Wade. So the decision in Roe versus Wade allows for the states to put reasonable restrictions on abortion. They just cannot ban it, and abortion can only be allowed through the second trimester. So some of the restrictions that Texas has put in place, no abortions after 20 weeks, must be performed by a licensed physician, minors must get parental consent, there has to be a 24-hour waiting period between when the person requests the abortion and when the procedure is done. Now women must submit to an ultrasound and hear the heartbeat of the fetus. And no public funds can be used for abortion except in the cases of incest, rape, or it's a threat to the life of the mother. There are some conservatives, like very, very, very extreme conservatives, who even want to get rid of that number 6 exception. Now, there was a lot of these rules were put in place a few years ago. There was, in 2013, Texas tried to push some strict requirements about the standards of surgical centers that perform abortions, the size of the hospital, that the doctors performing the abortions had to have admitting privileges at a local hospital. And that was when Wendy Davis did her 11-hour filibuster against this bill. The bill ended up passing, but it got struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court. So states can only push back so far when it comes to abortion. But Texas, our policies here in Texas as it pertains to abortion are some of the most conservative in the country, and we are constantly pushing back against the federal government. And then immigration. This is one that is going to play a big factor in this 2020 election. Texas is a border state. We used to be Mexico. We have a unique history. So today, around 17% of the total population of Texas is immigrant, both documented and undocumented. It could be much higher, and most people assume it is much higher, but immigrants typically don't respond to the census because they fear being identified and deported. The assumption has always been is that the largest group of immigrants in Texas are coming from Mexico, but that's not true any longer. It is still primarily Latinos, but the majority of Latinos that are crossing into Texas on the southern border are from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, places like that where those countries are dealing with extreme violence, unstable governments, things like that. And they're passing through Mexico to get here, but they're not actually Mexican. This is this is a big part of Trump's, campaign in 2016, build the wall, what did he call them? The caravans of immigrants coming to the border, all that kind of stuff. And most of them are from these three countries. Um, President starting in 2014 under President Obama, but into Trump's administration, we've increased apprehension and detention of immigrants. We have, as of 2014, we had 58,000 minors in detention. That number has increased pretty drastically. Now, the reason why this is important to state policy is because immigration, it costs money to deal with the issue of immigration. And so, one of the arguments, though, is that illegal immigrants come to our country and they are a drain on our tax systems and money and all that kind of stuff. And that's not actually true. There was a study done on the impact of undocumented immigrants living in Texas in 2006. And what was found is that most undocumented immigrants living in the state actually generate more tax revenue through what they pay in through sales tax, property tax, and government fees. It exceeds the amount of money that the state spends on immigrants. So it's actually generating more money for the state than the state is spending. So that argument that, undocumented immigrants cost the state and the country money, it's actually not a true argument. Um, but where immigration costs the state the most tends to fall on in the areas of medical care and education. So again, many of our undocumented immigrants, they can't get legal work, so they typically work for cash and things like that, which means that they don't have health insurance. So if their children are born here, they can qualify for CHIP or something like that. But when they have to get medical care, typically they're going to the ER to get that medical care because they don't have health insurance, which, if those bills aren't paid, someone has to make up that money, and it's typically the state. And then, of course, we have, increased needs for ESL education and things like that in our school districts, and a lot of that can be attributed to immigration as well. The DACA program is something that Texas has opposed. DACA, we've talked about it a little bit. It essentially allows undocumented immigrants who were brought here as children to stay on a visa to stay in the country legally. The problem is that the DACA program right now has no pathway to citizenship, which means that these individuals have to keep renewing this visa, and their fate is kind of up in the air because no President Obama implemented the DACA program because Congress wouldn't do anything about creating a pathway to citizenship. And President Trump has tried to end the DACA program, but the Supreme Court said that he couldn't. So right now, all these individuals are still kind of in limbo, just constantly paying to renew this visa, which isn't cheap. The hope is that maybe the next president will resolve this issue and create some kind of final step that individuals can take to get on a pathway to citizenship.